For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is Unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hi, welcome to another podcast adventure on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet. Today we're going to be talking about Revelation 4, verses 2 and 3. During our last podcast, we talked about the verse just before this on April 27th, and it kind of teed up for us what John is about to see as we begin our discussion of verses 2 and 3. If you're following along in my book, you can check out section 40, which gives you the nutshell version of what we'll be talking about today. But in verse 1, Jesus Christ had beckoned John to come up hither, and he's now in a visionary state and is about to tell us what he sees as we begin in Revelation chapter 4, verse 2, where it says, quote, "And immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne." Close quote. So let's break this down a little bit and first talk about what it means when it says that he was immediately in the Spirit. We find a similar reference in Revelation chapter 1, chapter 1, verse 10, where John said, quote, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet." Close quote. So you can get more description about what was going on with John in that verse from my podcast from January 14th of 2024, covering verses 9 through 11 in Revelation chapter 1. But the short sum of it is that John is in the Spirit, similar to the kinds of experiences that Ezekiel had and Nephi had and Joseph Smith. It basically means being raised to a higher spiritual state, and he was probably transported physically by the Spirit from Patmos to heaven. If you go back and listen to that podcast, it'll give you a little bit more detail about how and why that conclusion can be reached. But essentially, today we're going to be talking about what he sees as he is still, what we'd have to say is still in the Spirit, or he's now resumed in the Spirit after the 7 letters. Now keep in mind, we can't really doubt that the 7 letters were inspired of the Spirit. So it's not like John in chapter 1 was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. He has this vision of the resurrected Christ. He then leaves the Spirit, writes the 7 letters, and then now we can come back to the Spirit again. So the 7 letters were, of course, inspired of the Spirit, but we don't have him kind of transcending Earth's existence and going into heaven for purposes of doing his writing of the 7 letters. So as we begin here in verse 2, it tells us that there was this throne set in heaven. So let's talk about the imagery of a throne, because we're going to run into them a lot of times here in the book of Revelation, at least 40 times where we're going to be talking about thrones. It is a metaphorical word that is, of course, borrowed from images of monarchs and kings of the earth that have these mighty high places where they sit and where they rule from. And they have lots of symbolic uses throughout the book of Revelation, where thrones are set for judgment and other things like this. We have things like the throne of David that was promised to Jesus Christ as this concept or image of something that represents supreme authority. Most of the times these thrones tend to be rather symbolic rather than a particular form or a material structure. The idea is, what does the throne mean, not so much what does it look like. And so in Revelation 4 here, this throne that we're going to encounter is going to be the central object of this vision and is a sign and symbol of God's universal government. And so in the Greek word that this comes from is thronos, which is a term that is reserved for use for kings and gods and absolute rulers. So that's kind of what you have to be thinking in your mind when we see this throne in heaven, is this absolute rule of God the Father, who, as we see, is the one who's going to be seated on this throne. Now, this also tells us that this throne was set in heaven. Not that the throne was being set, but when John saw it through this open door, it was already set there. And that makes sense because John is looking at the paradise in heaven in the post-mortal spirit world as of 96 AD. Now, the big changes came to the post-mortal spirit world after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and during the time of his ministry, while he was in the post-mortal spirit world ministering for a 3-day period approximately until the time of his resurrection. Well, guess what? If John had been viewing paradise as of the time Jesus appeared there and came to establish a throne, then he would really, in symbolic terms, be seeing the throne under construction or being set, so to speak. But as of 96 AD, which is the time period of John's vision, that throne is there. And that's essentially what he is looking at. So now some of the original Greek manuscripts do tend to indicate that the setting of the stone was still in process. And I have no real objection to that, me of all people. What do I have to say? In terms of my interpretive process, because the spirit world, the post-mortal spirit world, is a dynamic place, and it is a kingdom. It is a part of God's kingdom. And so because it is a dynamic and a changing place, in a certain sense, the throne that is the expression of that kingdom is also changing. It's still in the process of being set as people continue to flow as disembodied spirits into the post-mortal spirit world, where they will be worshiping and they will be active and they will be doing things. They'll be doing missionary work and things of this nature over in that other part of the spirit world that we call spirit prison. All of these things are very dynamic, and so in a very real sense, the work that is going on there is for the building up of God's kingdom beyond the veil. And so in that sense, the throne is continually being set. Even though the image that John sees, it's actually been set there. And I think the need exists to understand it's having been set there as an immovable part of this post-mortal spirit world, because this is part of the promise that the saints are given, those overcomers, particularly the Laodicean saints who were the lukewarm saints, and having that promise that you can ascend to this throne yourself. And in that sense, isn't it true that the throne is still being set, because people who live worthy lives, righteous, who are exaltation worthy, they will be able to then sit on that throne. And so in a very real sense, it's still being set. So at any rate, the verb tense as used in the original Greek does kind of denote this unfinished action where it is reaching its completion at the time of the seeing, what John sees. And this has caused a number of commentators to assume that the vision that John is having corresponds with the second coming, which in other religions other than the LDS Church would be called the rapture, is the term that is associated with the second coming. And so there are a lot of writers who associate this vision with that time because of the idea that you have this throne and it is set and in the process of being set, so that, that must be the second coming. You'll find similar phraseology in Daniel chapter 7 verse 9, which records Daniel's vision of the great gathering of saints at Adam-on-Diamond, and it says this, quote, "I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire." Close quote. And so when Daniel is here describing how the thrones were cast down, that actually means thrones were set. So if you go back to the Hebrew in the Old Testament, then this phraseology would indicate the idea that the thrones of the saints, that the saints would then be allowed to inherit, were then set at the time of the gathering of Adam-on-Diamond. And we're going to get into a bigger discussion of this when we get to Revelation chapter 10, which is the chapter that John uses to describe the gathering of saints at Adam-ondi-Ahman. So, we have another 6 chapters to go. So you're going to have to be patient. Patience is a virtue, right? You go back and if you're concerned about that, you have to go back and think about the 7 letters to the churches where they're constantly being told to be patient. So that's the watchword for today. But at any rate, the idea is that we have the throne set in heaven that Daniel saw, the thrones that are set here in Revelation chapter 4, all being set by divine appointment and divine arrangement. The idea that it was set conveys this idea of stability of the government of God, and so it fixes definitely and precisely the seat of royal authority. And it's note that it's not placed with an emphasis on the location as much as it is an emphasis on the situation. That's what you should kind of envision with the throne, as we're seeing, not so much about where it is as much as the situation and context in which we are seeing it. And so the context is, of course, we're seeing it in heaven, which I described in my podcast with the Revelation 4 overview from April 21st. So that's really where you can get a lot of details. So I'm going to speak very cursorily as to what John is seeing and what he's viewing here in the post-mortal spirit world, because it's a foregone conclusion based on my earlier podcast. That's where we're at. And as I mentioned to you, the throne is still somewhat in a dynamic and growing condition, because you have to think about it in these terms. You have righteous people dying in 96 AD, just as we have righteous people dying today, and they enter the post-mortal spirit world, and that kingdom grows. And so go back all the way to 96 AD with the Nephites and all of the vicarious ordinances that they were doing on the American continent. And as people receive their vicarious ordinances, they become worthy to enter paradise. And so we got all kinds of people coming because of the missionary work that is going on. And keep in mind that their work began 60 years before John's vision, and with the crucifixion of the Savior and his appearance in the post-mortal spirit world, he bridges this gulf that existed between paradise and prison. It allows people to kind of go back and forth. So it's a happening place, and that's the nature of the throne that we see. And this idea of the evolution of the throne is kind of comparable to what happened in the days of King David when he was first anointed to become the king of Israel. For the first 7 years, his throne was located in Hebron because there was a competing claim by Saul's son, Saul being the first king of Israel, and his son made a claim that he should be the rightful king in Israel, even though Samuel, of course, had anointed David to become the king. So for the first 7 years, Daniel has his throne in Hebron, and eventually you kind of have this civil war going on, and Daniel ultimately prevails. The followers of Saul accede to the claims of David to be the rightful king in Israel, of a united Israel. And so then after 7 years in Hebron, he then moves his throne and it gets set in Jerusalem. And that throne and its influence continues to then expand as the united Israel continued to grow as what was existing in that time as the greatest kingdom on earth. Sorry that it didn't continue, but that's a story for another day. Now we're told here in verse 2 that one sat on the throne, and so we kind of begs the question, okay, who is this? And this is going to be God the Father is the one who's sitting on the throne. And some do misconstrue this and have thoughts, well, it could be the Savior, and so, but they also have a problem that sometimes they misconstrue the meaning of the vision and they expand it out over time. As I mentioned, some people view this as something that describes the second coming, and so that's how they contend to kind of say, well, this could be Christ sitting on it. But if we view it in its proper context and limit the scope of the vision to that period of time that we're talking about, which is 96 AD, then it becomes immediately obvious that God the Father is the only one that could be sitting on the throne at that time. So one of the comments that is made by Richard Draper is that he notes that God is omniscient, and so that he can basically be everywhere, and every when present, right? And so that's true. That's a true statement. He is omniscient, and he can be present everywhere, and he can be present at all times. But essentially, if we start to look at this vision as something that is representative of the paradise that exists everywhere and at all time, it misconstrues what the vision is talking about. And so we of course recognize that heaven always has a certain timeless perspective about us, but John in his revelation is really taking a snapshot, and he's going to take multiple snapshots. We're going to get a vision in 96. We're going to get a vision at the time of the second coming, and at the time of the resurrection, as people are leaving the spirit world because they receive their resurrected bodies. And so we have to kind of keep all of these things in mind, and then it truly helps us understand what's going. So I don't disagree with the concept that when we're talking about God, there is an eternal perspective about him. For example, Joseph Smith speaks of God saying, quote, "The past, the present, and the future were and are with him, one eternal now," close quote. And so that's true, but that doesn't divorce us from the idea that we can have still this snapshot of time that we're looking at, and the throne is being set for all time, but it doesn't mean that the vision reflects all time. It's like saying that Doctrine and Covenants section 138, which was Joseph F. Smith's vision of the redemption of the dead, and he has this vision that takes a snapshot of time of the post-mortal spirit world when he saw the Savior actually come into that world and bridge the gulf that existed between paradise and the spirit prison. But that's a moment in time, a 3-day moment in time, if you will, of what the Savior was doing during that 3-day period of time. So we don't ever interpret the 138th section of the Doctrine and Covenants as being representative of paradise as it existed and will always exist, as though it's a reflection of eternity, all in this one time period. And that's what John is doing for us here in Revelation chapter 4 and in chapter 5, as I've mentioned before. These are snapshots in time as of 96 AD. So when we talk of the eternal nature of God, I don't want you to lose sight of the idea that we have these specific things that happen, but he does have, of course, these attributes of eternity that are associated with him, which Bruce R. McConkie described when he said, quote, "By definition, God, generally meaning the Father, is the one supreme and absolute being, the ultimate source of the universe, the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good creator, ruler and preserver of all things. Of him, when considering the object upon which faith rests, the prophet observes that God is the only supreme governor and independent being in whom all fullness and perfection dwells, who is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient, without beginning of days or end of life," close quote. And so that includes a quote from the Lectures on Faith as quoted by Elder McConkie. But you can get this idea with God the Father being omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, that, oh, this vision we're looking at embodies all of those things and expands out to this kind of universal and panoramic vision of what John saw in Revelation 4 and 5, and that's just not the case. He's seeing again this kind of snapshot, and we're going to see this snapshot over again. In fact, John refers to God the Father 12 times in the book of Revelation as the one seated on the throne. So all of these are going to be this little chapters in this continuing and growing book that is described. So Daniel Ludlow kind of helps us get a little bit of perspective on this when he said, quote, "Although as a person with a physical body, he," meaning the Father, "can be in only one place at one time, yet his influence can be felt everywhere in the universe. He is omnipresent," close quote. So again, we have the notion that, yeah, God could be in every place all the time by his influence, but he himself is there. And in the context of what John is seeing in Revelation, he's seeing this image of God. We never get a full description or direct description of him except through symbolic images to reflect that his presence is essentially felt here in the spirit world, just as it felt at the same time in multiple other locations. And so I also tend to think that the correct expression of the presence of God in the postmortal paradise is that you have his presence and not necessarily the fullness of his presence or his person in that realm, because that's not the celestial kingdom. That is not the realm in which resurrected persons exist. We're talking about disembodied spirits, which the conditions are very similar. They mirror each other, but we're going to get the fullness of the Father in the celestial kingdom after we are resurrected with celestial bodies. And so we kind of have to keep all these concepts in mind a little bit. And for those who tend to think that Jesus Christ is the one who is enthroned in this vision of Revelation 4 and 5, that clearly cannot be the case, because if you go to Revelation 5 verses 6 and 7, we see Jesus standing before the throne as the Lamb of God. And so since he is completely identified separate from the person sitting on the throne, it leads us to conclude that only the Father there is seated on the throne. Okay, let's go on and talk about some of the things that we will learn about in Revelation 4:3 and some of the imagery that is used to describe the Father and this throne that we're looking at and introduced to in verse 2. It says in verse 3, quote, "And he that sat was to look upon like a jasper and a sardine stone, and there was a rainbow round about the throne, in sight like unto an emerald," close quote. So as I mentioned before, we never get a specific description of the Father and his person. It's always these images that are given as a symbolic description of the glory of God the Father without really attempting to describe the person of the Father. Contrast that with the vision that Joseph Smith had in the Sacred Grove in the spring of 1820, when he specifically describes, "What I saw was God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ standing on the right hand of God." And he really kind of describes their person as glorious, but it's clear to us that the Father had a body of flesh and bone, as did the Son. So we get this very good description of what they look like, but that's not what John does. All right, John consistently does not describe the Father pointing to any specific similitude, shape, dimensions, physical types, or anything like that. He just gives us these expressions in images that describe his glory and his splendor, the splendor of his person as this almighty king. And so it's almost like he is always kind of consistently hidden, also in part perhaps because he really is kind of indescribable. But the thing that was going on in the time of John, when idolatry was rampant in the Roman Empire, and I mean, you give a vision that says, "Here's God the Father, here's what he looks like," everybody starts running off and starts making these images. Oh, this is what God looks like. This is what John told us about. And so by kind of veiling his image somewhat and just expressing him or describing him in these expressive terms of his glory, it avoids this problem. And to a certain extent, it has created some of the dogma that exists in various religions who misconstrue what the Father does look like and who he really is. For example, James Talmage wrote in his book on the Articles of Faith about one view that Christian religions have on the essence and person of God the Father. And he said this, quote, "The Church of England teaches the present Orthodox view of God as follows: there is but one living and true God, everlasting, without body, parts, or passions, of infinite power, wisdom, and goodness. Then James Talmage goes on to say, quote, the immateriality of God is asserted in these declarations of sectarian faith is entirely at variance with the scriptures and absolutely contradicted by the revelations of God's person and attributes as shown by the citations already made, close quote. And so there you have it, where it's this kind of imagery that John uses that kind of perpetuates these kinds of views. But if you look at other scriptures where they're not facing the dangers that John faced, it becomes very clear what the person of the Father is and who he is like. And so we also have this imagery that is used kind of like the parables were used in the New Testament, that people of faith understand and have a belief in the true essence and persons of the Father by looking at the imagery that is provided to describe him, and they get it. People who don't have faith and who want to misconstrue the words of the prophets and apostles, they're going off in every possible direction, and that's the problem that you had. So as we continue here in verse thing, the person of the Father and his glory is described as jasper and sardine stones, and these stones are of course emblematic of God's glory. A jasper stone, which comes from the Hebrew word yashbeth, means glittering. So it's a gem of multicolored varieties. And so in using this to describe the Father, John is really probably describing, although there are many colors and varieties, he's probably describing this bright kind of sparkling whiteness associated with it. And this is kind of confirmed later in Revelation 21:18, where things are described clear as crystal. And so it kind of reminds me, when I think of the bright and sparkling and things like that, the Italian Job, which starred Donald Sutherland. And in the beginning of the movie, he's with Charlie, and Donald Sutherland is in a jewelry store buying diamonds for his daughter. And so he calls her on the phone. He wakes her up because of the difference in time, and he calls her up, and he's going to send her something sparkly. And she immediately says, "Well, does it have a receipt?" So at any rate, so that's essentially what we're talking about when we think of this jasper. It's something sparkly, right? And the jasper stone was one of the 12 stones inserted in the high priest's breastplate back in the good old days in the Old Testament. And it's also one of the 12 stones in the building of the New Jerusalem as described in Revelation chapter 21. And there it's described as this most precious and like unto crystal. And so some, based on these words, suggest and tend to believe that it could be a diamond is the actual stone that is being described here as a jasper. But in all senses, whatever and however we kind of slice it and dice it, if you will, it is an expression of the holiness of God, and that's what's intended. The second stone that is used to describe the essence and glory of the Father is the sardine stone. Now this is a fiery red colored stone, and it's a red with a really deep hue that approaches almost purple. And so it's also a stone that is capable of being highly polished, and it's a polish that would really last. And so these are, again, some of the things. And one of the things that when we think of this fiery red color, we think of eternal burnings. And this can be an expression that has a good expression that the Father dwells in eternal burnings, but it can also be really bad for people who are wicked, who will ultimately suffer eternal burnings as well. And so this stone, and the fact that it has this fiery red color, could also express, of course, his holiness, but it may also express the wrath and judgment of God that he will use to consume his enemy. And so we kind of tie this back to this expression of this blood red color, if you will. And so, but these are the two stones that are used to describe him. Now, collectively, you look at them, they are connected. It's not just you have one on the one hand, one on the other. They have a certain connection. And so these stones are respectively the last stone, that is the jasper stone, and the first sardine stone in the stones of the breastplate of the high priest. So the jasper stone was last, the sardine stone was first in the breastplate. And this is an allusion, of course, to some of the names of Christ and that convey the idea of eternal nature. The last is first, the first is last, the last and the first. Again, the idea we're trying to express here as we describe the essence of the Father is how he is first and last, the first and last stones of the breastplate. And so the jasper was also the first stone in the foundation that of John's vision when he sees heavenly Jerusalem. This is the celestialized Jerusalem in chapter 21. He sees jasper as being the first stone in the foundation. So the foundation is made up of 12 different stones. The jasper was the first. The sardine or sardius stone was the sixth, which always kind of perplexed me a little bit why it ended up as number 6, but it did. Well, someday it's one of those mysteries that we're going to have to figure out when we get on the other side. So the two stones together probably symbolize this idea of God's life, power over life and death. And so where you have the jasper, although it here is described as something that is white and sparkly, mostly it tends to be a stone that is green in color, and green tends to be a representation of life, whereas the sardine stone, as I mentioned, this blood red associated with death and wrath. So again, the two stones together kind of tend to depict this idea of life and death. Okay, coming to the last phrase in Revelation 4 verse 3, it says that there was this rainbow round about the throne in sight like unto an emerald. Now, so we have two things we have to kind of talk about here is the rainbow and then its color. So it describes this rainbow as being round about, which begs the question, are we talking here about a half circle or a whole circle? Because you and I, of course, are used to seeing a rainbow in the sky, and we never see an entire rainbow because we don't get to see it as it dives into a hillside or something. We only see the arch in the sky before us, and yet this talks about how the rainbow is round about, almost indicating that it's a rainbow that you get to see a full circle. Now that must be quite a sight. But if you compare this with Revelation 10:1, John is telling us, quote, "I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire." And the imagery here again tends to suggest that wearing the rainbow above him almost sounds like it was all the way around. And Bruce R. McConkie describes it when he describes the use of the rainbow roundabout. He describes it as encircling the throne. So more than likely, we're talking about a rainbow that is completely surrounding the throne, front, back, sides, all the way around. And this, of course, depicts everything that is connected with heaven. Creation tends to be concentric. You have galaxies that rotate around a great center. You have solar systems. You have the great governing star called Kolob that is at the center, nearest the throne or heavenly residence of God the Father. And all of the things then kind of go out from that in these concentric circles. And so why would we not have that kind of imagery being expressed here in the post-mortal spirit world called paradise, which is reflective and symmetric, synonymous with, in many senses, with the celestial kingdom. And so it would be odd to essentially have the throne, if it was only sitting on one side of this circle, this half circle. It's like, what's on the other side? Is that outer darkness or something like that? And so at any rate, the circle, of course, is a type for a symbol of perfection and eternity. So it makes sense that we're looking here at a rainbow that is all the way around. And the Greek word for rainbow essentially describes any bright halo that surrounds another body. Think of it in terms of, peacocks. For you peacock lovers, how the tail feathers, they got, when they spread out their tail feathers, it looks like all of these circles in their feathers. Or think of it in the sense of your eye and the pupil, and outside the pupil you've got the iris, how it basically kind of surrounds. And that's the kind of imagery that we're talking about. So that, having determined that, the only thing that we then have to decide, okay, is the circle rainbow lying in a horizontal or a flat plane, or is it, what we would tend to think of when we're looking in heaven and see this rainbow? It looks to us like it's vertical, goes way up in the sky and then back down on the ground. And there's not universal agreement on this among various commentators. Some say it's vertical, some say it's horizontal. And since I'm a guy that likes to get along with everybody, I say, why not a sphere? Let's think of it in 3 dimensions. And so at any rate, it could be. I'm saying this halfway in jest, but at any rate, the bottom line is the one thing I think that is pretty certain is that the rainbow is not like it's floating up above the throne. And I tend to think that the thing is lying in a horizontal plane, where you've got the rainbow in a circle with the throne at the center of the circle, and then you've got the 24 elders that we'll be just talking about next time. They have these thrones that are surrounding the throne of God, and all of the images, when you start building into this image of the throne and this rainbow, it makes the most sense to be looking at it as a circle in a horizontal plane, and others that are around it, the 24 elders. You've got these 4 beasts that are going to be there, and then the thing extends out and extends out as we go into chapter 5 in the book of Revelation. Okay, so then we come to the color. Notice that we're talking here about a rainbow, but this is an emerald colored rainbow. It doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have this prismatic rainbow with the 7 colors all broken down. Many tend to think that the rainbow, because we're using a rainbow image, is something that we can't entirely lose the colors, or we lose the flavor of the image. But the bottom line is, this is emerald color in the sense that it is the predominating color, even if we have some other hues of colors, and they tend to be subordinate to, or even lost to, the green color, which is the color of emerald. And the symbol that we take from this emerald rainbow, of course, it's a symbol of good. It is a symbol of an everlasting covenant that comes to us from Genesis chapter 9, verses 9 through 13, which was in the days of Noah, where the rainbow first comes into play. And it says this, quote, "And I, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, and with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, and of every beast of the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark, to every beast of the earth. And I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth." Close quote. So that again is where this imagery comes from, of the rainbow that we're now seeing in the postmortal spirit world. It's an expression of the covenant. This is the promise. This is the hope that righteous people have, and the Lord is kind of using this imagery to explain, I have not forgotten my covenant with you. And so this is what we're talking about here as we consider the rainbow. And so essentially, because of the rainbow associated with the flood becoming a sign or token of an unbreakable covenant that the earth would never be destroyed again by a universal flood of water. Keep in mind that doesn't mean that the earth won't be destroyed because of the wickedness of people, but it won't happen again by a flood of water. So you have to listen to the Lord's words carefully. You have to read them like a lawyer a little bit and make sure you're checking out the fine print, because he's not saying, I won't ever destroy the earth again, even though a lot of people live their lives today as though that were the promise that God had previously made. And so essentially all these imageries showing this green rainbow are these consolatory promises that exist in Christ that will follow the judgments and the tribulations and trials that we face here upon the earth. The bottom line is his judgments do not eclipse his mercy. And that's what we see represented in this horizontal rainbow of emerald color. It is the color of life that overarches everything else, and he is the light and the life of the world. And this is the appropriate color for green, because when we think of green, we think of springtime and green grass and things growing where once it was dead and everything like that. This is also the color of the Quetzal bird, which is Guatemala's national symbol. And of course the Quetzal bird and the idea of Quetzalcoatl from the ancient Americans had this idea that was associated with Jesus Christ. And so the color of the bird is green, and it's still today even Guatemala's national symbol. And so it's all allied with the coveted green stone of jade, and the bird and the gem signified life-giving water or rain. And so Jehovah was, of course, thought of anciently as the controller of rain and life-giving water. And so one other thing that ties the emerald rainbow to Jesus Christ is that emerald is also the color of the tribe of Judah. So each tribe, when you think about the breastplate of the high priest, each color kind of had its unique stone. The names of the tribes were inscribed on the stones, and so one of these stones was for the tribe of Judah, and it happened to be a stone that had an emerald color. And so this is from the tribe of Judah. And Christ, of course, was born through that lineage, and he was of the tribe of Judah. And so all of these colors of green become a symbol for Christ and his mercy and his ability to give life. And so that's the imagery that we find reflected here in Revelation chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. Thanks for listening to what I had to say today. Next time we're going to be talking about Revelation 4, verse 4, where we're going to start talking about these 24 elders that John sees seated in the area of this green rainbow that we've been talking around the throne of God. And so I thank you for listening, watching, subscribing, sharing, and caring, and for Jenna for all your help. And I will see you next time.